Experiencing homelessness are thought about in regard to a tier system. And so this is just a way of categorizing kind of the length that a person has been homeless and the reasons why they might be homeless. And the idea is if you can categorize this well and get a sense of the different numbers for each of these tiers, we may have different approaches that we would use to help that person or that group, the group of people, to bring those numbers down. So that's all part of the state effort. So tier 1 would be like someone has hard economic times and they end up homeless. They lose their job. They can work. They're very functional and all of that, but it's a tough economy. Maybe they got kicked out. Maybe they were married and got kicked out of the house or whatever. For some reason, they no longer have access. They end up in a shelter. That's considered a tier 1 homeless person. And so there's some programming out there that's really geared toward working with tier 1 people. Things like short-term rental assistance, get someone housed more quickly. Diversion programs that are new, but they have these prevention funds that have come in through HPRP, through the stimulus money that you've probably heard about that got passed, and everyone's saying, when's the stimulus money going to come down? Well, one part of the stimulus money went into homeless prevention, and it led to some of these like short-term rental subsidies is one place where it went. So it's the idea of when someone comes into a shelter, can we divert them to living with a friend, or if they need a detox because they're using, quickly over to a detox center if they're willing and they want that, or maybe it's patching up things with a landlord and we can do that and we have these monies to help supplement and can reconnect the person rather than paying, because the community ultimately pays for everyone that's in the bed at the shelter that costs money every night. So that's one thing. And then tier 2 people are all the folks that are coming out of institutions that end up homeless, whether it's from a medical institution or a mental health or the jails, or people like kids coming out of residences and they graduate out and they end up homeless, foster care, things like that. So those are big feeders into the homeless system. So we try to track all of that. And so there's the issue of, so how's that going to be resolved? Well, maybe a lot of these institutions that are doing the discharges should all have specialized housing programs attached to them, so they're not discharging straight to the streets, but rather actually, at least transitionally, housing some of the folks, particularly in the jails. That would be pretty good, because it's hard enough being homeless, but imagine if one of the main feeders into it is the jails. So every day at the shelter, people are going directly from the jails to the shelters, and then you got other people in the shelters too. It's just a hard environment to begin with. I mean, you can track the folks coming out of the jails easily enough and give them other opportunities. That would seem maybe like a better plan. Tier 3 are the people that are long-term homeless with disability that are in the shelters. And that's the chronically homeless. And then tier 4 are all of the people that are living outside. Maybe they're sometimes going into shelters, but usually they're living outside. So that's the tier system. Once you get someone housed, what's the structure? What's the meaning? What's going to make them feel that they really live here and have a residence and a home? Meaning is very important, and it's a whole other level. I worked with a guy for years who lived outside, and he had a lot of meaning wrapped up in him living outside. It wasn't just, people don't just live outside, and when they adapt in all sorts of ways. So I used to work with one guy at the Port Authority in New York City. The way he adapted is he saw himself as the night watchman for the Port Authority. I mean, of course he wasn't, but that's what made him feel in charge and in control. There was another guy who was living on a subway, and he felt like he was like the transit authority, living on the subway, and he'd go from car to car and kind of stake people out and stuff. That was his way of taking charge. Somewhat delusional, yeah, probably, but also it's a way of adapting to a very painful situation and not feeling like you're a victim, but you're more in charge. And so anyway, so you see this a lot. So it's always a question: how are people adapting, and how can we help them? You know, a guy that's out there cleaning all the time, and I say, well, we hooked him to an apartment where he can clean and feel like he's giving something back through the cleaning. So instead of that cleaning sticking out as something, oh, that's a little odd, he's actually doing something useful that people appreciate and, you know, people applaud. And for a moment I was thinking about someone else we had placed. I don't know, it'll come back to me. I can't think of it right now.
And so...
let me just say this while I have it. So there was a guy that I knew who lived in the woods, and his thing was, you know, he's a survivalist. I mean, that was important to him, that he felt he can take it. Doesn't matter what the elements were, he could take it. And he had a lot of pride in that. Also, he had a friend that died in the river, and he would overlook that river. And to him, he was the watcher of a very sacred place where his friend died, kind of where his soul went up and all of that. So he has this whole story around it, but to him, it was like he was the watcher of a sacred burial ground where his friend died. And he was the survivalist, the woodsman, and people got to sort of know him that way, living in the woods. So now, I'm the outreach worker working with him. I want to bridge him over to maybe a little bit of a safer existence. I don't want him to die. He's drinking a lot. He's getting older. He's living outside. So the challenge is, how do you do that? And when you introduce him to a room that's away from all of that meaning that I just talked about, it can pale in comparison. And so we say, well, he doesn't want it. Just leave him there. See, I don't agree with that either, because I think you can get to know him and you can begin to build meaning in that transition to the room.